My name is Panos Moumsis. I'm with the Transformative Agenda team. I would like to welcome you all in today's webinar. Today's topic, we're looking at prioritization in humanitarian operations. How do we prioritize when everything is a priority? How do we make sure that the prioritization part of the humanitarian program cycle, how does it fit, and really how do we go about it in order to make these very difficult decisions on the ground? Before introducing the speakers and the topic, I would like to say just 2 words on the ground rules with regards to the webinar. First of all, I would like to ask you all to keep your microphone muted at all times. This is important in order to enable this conversation. This webinar is going to last for a total of about 90 minutes, so 1 hour and a half. During the first 45 minutes, I will be asking questions to the 4 speakers to introduce the topic and trying to get their reflections, their reactions on the issue. During the second 45 minutes, I would like to take questions that you can send to us, to me, which then I will take over and forward to the speakers to try and make sure that their answers really are as close to what you would like to hear to contextualize it to your own situation. I would like to point out the fact that on the top right-hand side of your screen, you see 4 buttons: participants, chat box, Q&A, and polling. I want to particularly point out to the chat box. If you click into that, there is a box where you can, at any given time during the webinar, to interact with other participants or with the speakers in the webinar. This is a very interactive platform, so please make sure of the chat box to reflect, to share your views, and to share with other colleagues that are also participating at this webinar. The next button to the top right-hand side of your screen is the Q&A box. Again, I would like to encourage you to use the Q&A box. Please send your questions at any given time during the webinar. These questions come to me, and as I said, during the second 45 minutes part of the webinar, I will be bringing your questions to the speakers to make sure that these questions are answered in a timely manner. Now, there is also a polling that you see in front of you. We have an opening polling that as we speak, please take a minute to give us some feedback in terms of what we're trying to do is to get a sense of who is listening and who is on the board online with us. And talking on who is listening, I really want to particularly encourage the participation of colleagues from across the globe. We have a strong participation, particularly from Latin American countries, North America, but I also see colleagues from 12 countries in Africa. We have 6 countries in the Middle East. A very strong participation, over 100 people online. So a warm welcome to all of you, and we very much hope that you will find this webinar useful and helpful from your point of view. We have actually asked all our speakers to give you practical and hands-on advice in terms of how they've gone about applying the prioritization in their own context. There will be also a number of documents that will be downloaded, which provide some steps and some comparative analysis of what has taken place in terms of best practices at field operations that we hope would be of help for your own operation. So today's webinar is really about prioritization in humanitarian operations. We have all been in situations where we face the impossible task of having a large number of humanitarian needs, often deteriorating and increasing, while at the same time the resources are not in place. So the purpose of today's webinar is really to answer to the question on what is prioritization within the context of the program cycle. And we really want to give participants some best practices, some practical examples on how to do it or how colleagues have gone about implementing it. There is a sense that there is a considerable confusion around prioritization. And really, how do we contextualize it within the program cycle when it happens? Some colleagues have said that there's a tendency to see some early parts of the need analysis and the planning phases as the prioritization itself. We will be talking in a minute about the boundary setting and how to do that, which we hope participants will find quite useful in terms of how to go about it. So with that brief introduction, I'd really like to move to our next speaker and first speaker, and I'd like to go actually to Iraq, where I'm delighted to introduce Liz Grande, who is the Deputy Special Representative of the Secretary General. She's the Resident Coordinator and Humanitarian Coordinator for Iraq. Before going to Liz, I also want to introduce Emily Fernandez, who is the coordinator for the NGO Forum Secretariat in Democratic Republic of Congo. And Emily is joining us from Kinshasa and will be bringing on the table the very strong also NGO voice and experience in participating in the prioritization process. I'd like to next introduce Andrew Wiley, who is the Chief of Program Support at the branch office in OCHA here in Geneva, and actually Andy is with me here in the office. Andy comes with a strong experience from having been the head of the office in DRC, in Haiti, and with good practices and experiences from the field. And lastly, we have with us Dylan Winder, who is the head for the Humanitarian Policy and Partnerships at DFID in London. Dylan will be bringing to us not just the DFID perspective, but also the broader donor perspective in terms of how to go about prioritization and what are the practical steps that from a donor perspective they would like to see happening when considering projects on the ground. So I'd like to start with a first question and go to Iraq, to Liz. Liz, you have recently undertaken quite a rigorous exercise in terms of prioritization of the response in Iraq. Out of a 2.2 billion operation, you had to bring it down to about a quarter of that, and in what became the revised Humanitarian Response Plan. So I would like to ask you, first of all, why did you prioritize, and how does the prioritization contribute to a more effective and efficient response from your point of view? Liz, over to you.
Panos, thank you, and allow me to greet all of the panelists and everyone who's been able to join us this afternoon. The country team in Iraq was forced to prioritize because we were faced with a set of conditions that we needed to address, and we had to do so urgently. Basically, we were out of money. We had an L3 emergency operation, which was in trouble with many parts of the operation off rails. As a country team, we were trying to do too much. However, we were not really having the impact which the beneficiaries and affected communities expected us to have. We were in a situation where, although there were huge needs at the time that we started prioritization, we were aware that in coming months, those needs were expected to increase exponentially. So in trying to address the issue of stretching the limited resources that we had, we wanted to do that in a way which was principled, which was logical and evidence-based, which was transparent, and to stretch our resources so that we were laying out a collectively agreed roadmap for the activities that needed to be sequenced as we moved forward. So that was the context within which we undertook this exercise. If you allow us to share, we did so with a great deal of trepidation. We knew that in prioritizing that we were going to be coming up against entrenched political interests within the humanitarian community. And to be frank, we were not anticipating otherwise. You know, when you talk about prioritization, it's easy to make it sound like it's a relatively straightforward technical exercise. We knew that wasn't going to be the case. anytime you say in a life-saving situation that some things are going to be of higher priority than others, and you do so with a lot of actors that have very strong mandates, by definition, you are going to be involved in a difficult political discussion. And we were aware of that when we started in Iraq, which is why we made a commitment to have the entire country team implicated and involved in the prioritization. We wanted to share the risks that were involved in the exercise as a whole. Panos, over to you.
Thanks, Liz. You're describing a very grim picture with an L3 emergency, looking at the impact, looking at the needs, looking at the fact that you had no funds, and looking, I guess, more importantly about how to really do this exercise on a collective way with all the actors in order to bring the credibility needed for the operation. I'd like actually to move on to Dylan in London. And Dylan, I wanted to ask you, actually we have received a question from one of the participants who sent it in advance, who said donors are always pushing us to do more or to do better within prioritization with the funds that we have. Is this because of the lack of resources, or is it because of the lack of faith in the credibility of the Humanitarian Response Plan in terms of how to respond? Because clearly, and if we look, for example, at the 2015 needs, globally we need over about $20 billion. And the anticipation is that for 2015, we may get half of it. So clearly the resources are not enough. But can we hear your perspective, please?
Yeah, thanks, Panos. And again, delighted to be here and on such a distinguished panel. I mean, first of all, I think it's a bit of both. So it is a little bit about needing to better prioritize and better get more prioritized response plans, but it's also about the sort of broader rising need and the kind of lack of resources. So maybe if I can just step back a little bit from a DFID perspective. Looking globally, we're now at 0.7%, so we're not growing anymore. For us, it's about choice and how do we decide both between appeals and within them. We have increased our resources, so we've gone up over the last few years from about 7% to 12% of DFID budget going on the humanitarian sector. But we do lack some of the kind of ways in which we can prioritize between appeals. So, for example, L3 is about surges, not necessarily about prioritizing. So how do we as donors do that? I do think that in terms of the actual appeals themselves, if you look a couple of years ago, I think we did think they were bloated. My ministers would be saying, well, actually, we're only going to fund 50% of an appeal because we think that there's a lot of over-egging going on. But I think now, because of the strategic process that the new PCM has been going through, we're in a much better position and we've got much more confidence in appeals. And I think the fantastic job that Lisa's been doing in Iraq really demonstrates how we can prioritise at a time when we do have limited resources. But we must be doing this against need. I think we are concerned around proliferations of individual appeals. You know, we need to be consistent. We need to be able to make sure that we are meeting genuine unmet needs. And we also need to be looking at how do we really use the valuable resources we've got in the humanitarian budgets well, and not do things that we might cover better by the development budget. So I think that's a sort of global answer. I think the other thing actually we can do is invest more in building resilience and preparedness, which does provide better value for money in advance. So for me, at a global level, it's about mixing up our different instruments and having the best solution for the different types of contexts which we're working in. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Indeed, a challenging situation, even from a donor perspective, in terms of how to look at this and how to support them. I'm actually going to move on to Andy. And Andy, I have to say that just looking at the statistics, 75% of the viewers, of the listeners who answered are either humanitarian coordinators, member of the HET, or members of the cluster or intercluster group. So we really have a lot of colleagues, and I am particularly welcome the fact I see several humanitarian coordinators, 9 actually, on the line following this conversation. So Andy, I would like to ask you, from your perspective of obviously having been in the field, but also now being in charge of the program support branch and OCHA here in Geneva, What do you see as the different ways with which prioritization of the humanitarian response plan can or has taken place within the program cycle? If you could give us some best examples and also in terms of how you support and what you have seen at the field level. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Panos. Also very pleased to be on the panel today, and a warm hello to colleagues in the field and at headquarters. Panos, in your opening, you alluded to some of the confusion and misunderstanding about what we mean when we talk about prioritization. And I think it's important that we make a distinction between what we call boundary setting, which is a part of the strategic planning process, and then setting or establishing priorities within that strategic plan. As Dylan suggested, the collective, the humanitarian system, has been working hard to make sure that the plans that we're developing, by analyzing needs and determining what needs we need to meet, and therefore what are the boundaries for our response, what do we actually need to do to meet those needs and achieve our objectives, we are becoming much more strategic, and our plans much more credible. Our intention is that when a plan does come out, that it represents 100% of the minimum, as Stephen O'Brien has said, of what needs to be done in that context. So the question of prioritization isn't about what of that plan should happen and what doesn't need to happen. It all needs to happen. So the question is really about when. And so that's where we step from the activity of setting boundaries to actually doing the prioritization, to looking at the specific activities within that plan and determining what needs to happen first. And applying, obviously, some criteria to identifying what those activities are, to sequencing the activities. Now, there are different kinds of criteria that are used. There are some of the kind of the general criteria that are more or yet less used globally, like life-saving, like time-sensitive. And then you may have some context-specific criteria that are agreed by a humanitarian country team at the field level. But I think Lee's laid it out well. The key in making that prioritization work is having that discussion, that open, transparent discussion about the criteria, and making sure they're agreed in an objective fashion, and then using those criteria to actually do the prioritization. The question then is whether you take that, you stop that at an activity level, or you take it down to the level of specific projects. But the idea is you will come up with a prioritization that can help a humanitarian country team determine what resources need to go where at any moment in time. And that information is also, of course, useful for the donors who are putting resources into the operations. The reality is, if we don't do that prioritization, the donors will. Dylan talked about the choices that they need to make, and they are looking to us to help make those choices, and that's why the prioritization is so useful. Back to you, Panos.
Andy, thanks. Very important, very simple but very important 2 steps that I think colleagues can take onto their operation. Step 1, setting the boundaries. Step 2, setting the prioritization criteria in a collective but transparent way within the team to be able to take it forward. So really that's very extremely important. I'd like actually to take us now to Kinshasa, where Emily Fernandez with the Danish Refugee Council has been working there for the last 8 years, since 2007, and has been involved in a number of capacities on the ground. Emily, you're supporting the NGO community at the moment as the NGO Forum coordinator, and has also worked in the past as a member of the Pool Fund. Can you tell us how prioritization works for the Pool Fund? And I need to correct, actually, it's with Oxfam and not the Danish Refugee Council. What are the steps that has been taken in terms of the prioritization in the Democratic Republic of Congo? Who is involved? Do you really feel that it makes a difference in a country as big, as vast as DRC, a protracted crisis with huge needs on the ground? So, Emily, over to you.
Yes, thanks, Panos, and hello to every participant and panelist. Yes, of course, DRC is a big country with complex and protracted crises with huge needs, and with a limitation of funds, we are obliged to prioritize to be more efficient. And for our experience for the Pool Fund, in fact, it is based, the prioritization of the Pool Fund is based on the prioritization of the humanitarian needs overview. And in DRC, we have a prioritization in 4 crises, and we defined the crises according to their extent, their severity, the impact on the population. So we defined for the crisis of violence and armed groups, the crisis of malnutrition, the crisis of epidemics, and the possible crisis of natural disaster. And for each crisis, we try to do a prioritization of targeted people to reach, and a geographical mapping of the vulnerability by crisis, and what would be their specific activities for this crisis, with a minimum package for each clusters to answer for each crisis. And to give a little bit more example, with the map you can see in online, we try to do a geographical mapping of the vulnerability, as I said, with, for example, this one about violence and armed groups, with indicators and the 2 indicators of the data for new movement of population, new IDPs and new returnees, and the data related to a number of attacks on physical integrity. It gives us some codes in color, as you can see, giving the severity of the vulnerability in each territory of every provinces we have in DRC, with aggravating factors we take into account as a rate of IDP on the total of the population, the physical access and security access. So with this, we use it for the Pool Fund prioritization too. We based, and quite every donor in DRC are following our HNO and HRP. And to give an example, for the last standard allocation of the Pool Fund we launched last year, it was an allocation for cross-cluster and multi-year funding with a resilience approach for projects between 18 to 24 months. And the first step was to prepare the launch, to know where and which axis we will reach. And we did it at the provincial level. At the provincial level, we have like a provincial HCT, where there are members of NGOs, national NGOs, UN agency, and OCHA. And they for example, in North Kivu, they decided to focus this allocation on areas where there are most of the needs, according to the HNO, but a lack of actors to fill the gaps. And then we launched the Humanitarian Coordinator launched the standard allocation, and then for the we received 121 proposals. That means 165 million of dollars of needs, but we had an envelope of only 30 million. So we had to select only 18 projects, which was quite hard work to do and some tough decisions to make. For example, one of the provinces, South Kivu, had no project selected, but we had to follow some agreed criteria which were validated by the pool fund board. So with the different members of the pool fund board, with NGOs and donors. And it is very important to say that in the step of the selection, we had a really participatory process with the involvement of every actor and with a bottom-up approach from the provincial level to the capital. And for us, for NGOs, it's very important because to have the transparency of the process and to know exactly how it was selected and what were the choices, it's really important. Of course, it takes time. And in a complex and evolving crisis, sometimes it creates some difficulties. But the pool fund is quite flexible, so it's okay. And well, for us too, it's really important the provincial level of coordination. For every allocation, from standard allocation or specific allocation, the provincial level gives the alert warning and gives the alert warning in case of a crisis. And the provincial level of coordination, as I said before, includes all humanitarian actors and some representatives, of all humanitarian actors. And to be effective and efficient, the prioritization should include midterm review, which is not so well done here, and more analysis on gaps based on consolidated data, which is a problem here in DRC to have good data. Okay, back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Emily. A complex operation. We heard you talk about 11 provinces, a bottom-up approach, selecting out of 121 proposals, only 18 projects. Out of 165 million in terms of needs, having only 30 million in pool fund. Of course, not every country has a pool fund to be able to allocate, but the process is really what we're looking in terms of how to identify what Andy was talking, the boundaries, and moving then into the next steps to be able to fit it within a program, within a wide country, a wide number of factors, and distilling it to really, hopefully, the right decisions to be able to use the limited resources versus the enormous needs. I'm going actually to move now from Kinshasa back to Iraq. And Liz, I'd like to come towards you. And we would really like to hear from you about the prioritization that you did in Iraq in a little bit more detailed way. So how did you go about this prioritization? Who made the decision? How was the ATT, the clusters, the NGOs, the donors involved? What lessons have you learned from this very vigorous exercise that you undertook on the ground? So if you can walk us the steps on how you went about it, that would really be great. I know many colleagues are looking into your example as well to get inspired and follow in their operation. Liz, over to you.
Panos, when we started the prioritization exercise, we were doing so on the basis of a strategic response plan, which was absolutely huge. The response plan came to more than $2.2 billion. And we were struggling, although a number of donors had been generous, we were struggling to get that funded. So the very first thing that we did was to identify those priorities within the existing strategic response plan that needed to be fast-tracked. These were programs which were facing either closure or a dramatic scaling back because they didn't have the money that they needed. We did that in February. We came up with a document, we literally called it Fast Track Priorities, and we identified $150 million worth of programs that we sought funding for. Most of that funding was generated, but as soon as we went through that first prioritization exercise, we realized that we were encumbered by a strategic response plan that was, it included an awful lot of things, and it lacked credibility. So we made a collective decision as the humanitarian country team to rigorously prioritize what our program had been. If you allow me to say, when we launched the new Humanitarian Response Plan, we did that in early June in Brussels. One of the very first points that we made in launching it was that this was not the appeal we had hoped to launch. What the humanitarian country team wanted to do was to have a very clear, crisp, evidence-based explication of the needs across all of Iraq, including in areas where we have difficulties accessing the people in need, areas that are controlled by armed groups, including ISIL. What we would have then liked to have done, having explicated those needs, is to present a full package of all the things we wanted to do to ensure that international standards in humanitarian assistance were reached. That's not what we did, however. And we didn't do it because the donors had been absolutely clear with us that we were not a priority to be funded. We didn't have credibility because our previous plan was too bloated, and we needed to take very dramatic steps to try and turn around the situation. So the steps we took were as follows. First of all, we did ask each cluster to confirm a needs across the country. We had hoped that we would do that on the basis of a single standardized methodology across all clusters. Our operation wasn't mature enough to do that, and so each cluster individually identified the needs. The next thing that we did was to remind ourselves and reconfirm what the international standard of support should be for each cluster. What is the international standard for water and sanitation? The international standard for shelter, the international standard for health, and so forth. Then what we did was we said to each cluster, identify the minimum package of support that you intend to provide against those standards. Knowing that we're not going to reach the standards, what do you as a cluster commit yourself to doing to contribute to the achievement of the standard? The gap between the international standard and the minimum package we refer to as the ethical gap. As humanitarians, we fully recognize that there is a global commitment to ensure that people who have been forced from their homes because of violence, people who are in trouble, receive assistance that meets a certain standard. In the case of Iraq, there wasn't a chance that we were going to be able to reach that. So the difference between what we committed ourselves to as clusters and what the international standard were, we called the ethical gap. And we wanted to be absolutely clear and transparent about that. We did not want to pretend that the minimum package we were putting forward met the standard. And that's why we were very clear about the gap between the two. We then asked each cluster, having defined the minimum package for their cluster, to sequence that against first-line responses, the activities they would do in the first line, second-line responses, and then their third sequence set of activities, what we call the full cluster response. We also made sure that we didn't take, if I may say, the easy way out. In other words, we said to each cluster, you define what you consider to be first line, what you consider to be second line, and what you consider to be a full cluster response. In a number of cases, clusters identified as their first-line response activities which were not necessarily life-saving, but which were seen as critical in the context in which we're operating in Iraq. After the clusters had sequenced their minimum packages, we then asked each cluster to defend their minimum package and the sequencing of that package in front of a peer group. That peer group included 2 representatives from frontline NGOs, 2 UN agencies, 2 donor representatives, and then some ex officio members. And each cluster came forward and they presented, number 1, the minimum standard, number 2, the minimum package for their cluster, and number 3, how they envisioned the sequencing of activities through a first line, second line, and full cluster response. In a number of cases, we asked the clusters to rethink the logic of some of their activities. We really pushed them. As a peer group, we were looking for the logic of what they were doing. We wanted to see evidence that what they were advocating as a strategy had worked in other contexts, would work in the case of Iraq. We were looking for things like value for money as well. And that was all part of the engagement that the peer group had with each of the clusters. So Panos, roughly, that's the process that we followed. If you allow me to say, all the way through it, we understood that prioritization implied a very significant advocacy effort by all of the members of the country team. And that goes back to that ethical distinction between the minimum packages which we were setting forth and the standards as agreed internationally. We all recognize that it was our collective responsibility to advocate with the government, to advocate with traditional donors, to advocate with potential donors that don't come from the traditional community, but which might be prepared to support humanitarian action in Iraq. It was incumbent upon all of us to do what was necessary to advocate with partners, as I said, so that that gap, that decisive gap between the standard and the package could eventually be met through other resources. Panos, back to you.
Thanks, Liz. Thanks for articulating the Iraq case, which is really quite complex, both in terms of size, being in an L3, the security, the operational, every complexity that could exist. But at the same time, almost hitting 2 birds with 1 stone, looking at the prioritization, but also at redoing basically the needs and the appeal in a way that was transparent. And thank you for walking us through the steps. We're particularly interested to hear really about the minimum standard, the international standard, the ethical gap, the sequencing that you went to take place, but also the advocacy that has gone with it to be able to pull it all together. So quite a well thought step to bring a huge complex operation into really what you describe as a first line and a second line of response for the operation itself. I'd like actually now to move to London, and Dylan, I'd like to come back to you. And I have to say, we have started getting questions from listeners. I want to encourage more questions to come in. This is the part that we go really more to make sure that your questions are answered. One of the callers has actually sent us a question saying that donors always ask us to do the prioritization. At the same time, we're seeing a number of donors who are funding projects outside the Humanitarian Response Plan, despite the fact that we have prioritized Iraq, Syria, a number of operations are a good example of that, and it's actually several donors, not just 1 donor. So how do you square the circle? How does, the prioritization surely should receive some recognition and reward from the donors in terms of really funding within the prioritized activities, yet we see funding going outside. Can we hear your views, please? Dylan, over to you.
Technical glitch there. Thanks, Panos. 2 comments really before I answer that specific question. The first one is just in terms of the sort of how donors, I think, engage on some of these prioritization processes. of course, we want to leave that to country teams. You know, we're not experts necessarily ourselves, although DFID does have quite a lot of humanitarian advisors on the ground. But I think that's very much, you know, we rely on the expertise of the clusters and the country teams themselves to come up with that. I think within that, you know, some of the first line type issues that Lisa's talking about, protection is something I think we see as being first line, but often missing. But also, I think it's really important, again, what Lisa was saying about the kind of engagement with the donors on these issues. So, for example, being part of a peer group, being part of HCTs is really important to help us understand the prioritisation process, and then we must reward you. So we should reward good prioritisation, as we've seen on the Iraq side, by making sure that it is funded. So then coming on to the caller's question about funding that falls outside appeals. I think there are probably two things here. One is that quite often, particularly in natural disasters, rapid onset type responses, the time frame in which appeals are put out are too long for us. Most donors will make decisions within the first sort of days and hours of a rapid onset response, particularly, say, I would say maximum 3 days, particularly when stuff is in the media. So really we need to have a better process, and perhaps this is something that Andy can talk to from an OCHA perspective, about how we are able to coordinate some of those very early decisions that we make. Secondly, we also quite often have programs running already. If I take the recent example in Nepal, DFID had quite a lot of development programming, which we reoriented after the earthquake. So we had a big social protection program, we had a big violence against women program, we oriented that. And I think where you see good planning is, for example, the work that's gone on in Lebanon, which Ross Mountain's been driving around the Lebanese crisis response plan, which is looking at both the sort of existing donor activities on the development side as well as the humanitarian side. And I do think as well, that making the point again, having a discussion locally on some of these issues is really important as well. So again, engaging donors on the ground as you're developing these will, I think, bring us more into the appeals. But absolutely, for us, first principle is, once the appeal's there, we need to be supporting programs within the appeal. Thanks.
Thanks, Dylan. Andy, I'd like to come to you. We have heard the Iraq model Liz described. We have heard the Emily model in a pool fund and really in DRC and how they've gone about it. I'm sure at OCHA you have seen a number of models or different approaches in terms of prioritization. So I'd like to ask you, and actually colleagues there's a message, a question that came saying, what is the ideal prioritization looks like? What would be the steps that you would see such a mechanism from your perspective, and of course making it fit within the humanitarian response cycle? Andy.
Thanks, Panos. Let me touch a little bit on the ideal approach, and then we'll go into a little bit of detail on some good examples, some good practice out there. You know, as you've seen, and as Liz has suggested, that the best prioritization exercise starts with a solid needs-based plan that has clearly set the boundaries for the humanitarian response. That plan obviously is based on the consolidation and analysis of needs data, and the identification of what capacities exist to meet those needs, including those of the international community as well as others. And then on that basis, determining what will be the focus of the humanitarian response plan, whether on specific geographic areas, population groups, and then what are the specific activities that we need to be putting in place to support those people. So that's what we talk about when we say the boundaries. So you have to have that plan in place first that sets the boundaries. The next step is then, as I talked about earlier, is agreeing the prioritization criteria. And there are different kinds of criteria, as I mentioned. The global criteria, most life-saving, time-critical, critical enabling, and then you may have you may apply some context-specific criteria, looking at cost efficiency or supporting impact by other clusters. In other words, activities depend on activities of one cluster depend on the activities of another. Or looking, applying criteria such as activities that support local actors if one of your overall objectives is to try and build resilience. So it's a matter of determining what are those criteria you're going to apply at the field level, and then looking at once the criteria have been agreed, doing initially a first level of prioritization, and that first level should look at the activities in your plan, deciding what needs to happen when, and hopefully having a categorization of prioritization that's not too complicated. You know, one being immediate priority, and perhaps then another category. Some humanitarian country teams have taken it a step further and again done a prioritization based on projects, but that's only actually happening in a few places, and it's really related to those countries where they need to make a specific request for a set of projects. And then the key is to make sure that prioritization exercise is not just a one-off that happens at the beginning of the year, but then you come back to it throughout the year, review potentially both the criteria, but specifically how you prioritize, and see if there are any new activities that need to move into that high priority area. The key thing to remember is just because you're prioritizing a set of activities doesn't mean you're saying the rest don't need funding or don't need to be implemented. They remain as important and as critical to achieving the strategic objectives of the plan as the others. It's just a matter of what is most urgent. So there may need to be a concerted effort to mobilize resources if those aren't coming from the traditional sources of funding. So some examples of countries that have applied parts of this approach. We've heard a lot about Iraq, and I think you'll see there what Lise and the team have done is very much kind of consistent with that ideal approach. They have taken the step of realizing that their plan did need to be reworked, and so they needed to go back and review those boundaries. But again, that is something that may need to be done at one point in an operation. So South Sudan is one example where the humanitarian country team, following the establishment of the boundaries in their plan, came up with some clear prioritization criteria. And they used primarily the global criteria that we talked about. They didn't do a prioritization by sector, but instead did a prioritization, they didn't prioritize activities, but prioritized instead a set of projects. And so when their plan came out, they basically said they needed the funding for that. They needed 37% of the budget total to implement that set of projects. They did their prioritization at the right time, setting the criteria and applying those during the planning process. Somalia did a little bit differently. They actually didn't define criteria at the level of the HCT, but instead went to the clusters and said, what are your priority activities? And left it up to the clusters within the groups to determine what were the priority activities. So there wasn't a consistent set of criteria applied across the clusters. which perhaps isn't the ideal, but they did come up with a prioritization. Ultimately, what they said was 90% of the total projects in the plan were prioritized, but that was the case for Somalia. They did also start that at the beginning of the year as it was intended. Syria has a prioritization process ongoing. They're actually doing it in the middle of their implementation of the current plan. They have set prioritization, some prioritization criteria, but since they are doing it in the middle of the implementation of the plan, as opposed to at the beginning, they're finding it a bit difficult to do. Again, it's hard when you have projects already ongoing, funding, resources already going to those projects, to then prioritize or potentially deprioritize some activities. So that's why it's presenting a bit of a challenge, and potentially they could look to the example of Iraq to assist with that. And then finally, Yemen, another example where the HCT didn't agree prioritization criteria, but instead left it up to the clusters. That process is currently underway, and they are focusing on prioritization of activities, because Yemen happens to be a case where they don't do a project-based budget associated with their humanitarian response plan. So that situation is ongoing. So again, we don't necessarily have examples where we can show you the ideal situation in place, but I think what's more encouraging is that we have many more countries that are moving more and more towards that ideal. And a number of countries kind of starting to set the example, like Iraq and like the ones we've just talked about. Back to you, Panos.
Andy, thank you, and thanks for really bringing to life these 4 different examples. Also, we can see the different ways that each operation basically tried to tailor it, make it to what made sense. I'd like actually to move to Liz, and Liz, your presentation has prompted several questions that we have got, and I'd like to combine at least 4 of them that are all in the same direction, from colleagues from the Middle East, I see Nigeria, a number of countries who are all reacting to what you've just said. And the question is really related about this collaborative work that you described, this transparent, but also that requires a willingness. So the question is, how about if there is an inability or an unwillingness of the humanitarian worker actors to work together? About the caller is asking about this possible lack of solidarity, and linked to that, and I'd like to put it also together, there are 2 different people who are saying that you talked about how you brought together the clusters, and basically how there was this defense committee, and how this, in a transparent way, you went through identifying the priorities. And the caller is saying, isn't it time to get away from the traditional silo cluster approach and to start looking at prioritization in a more holistic way? Rather than asking each cluster to prioritize, shouldn't this be done through the inter-cluster level? And also linked to the cluster, and I'm going to also put it together, is when we ask the cluster to define the minimum package and let them inform the sequencing of the cluster response, doesn't this result to a resource-based management instead of a results-based management? So Liz, lots of questions related to your presentation. Over to you.
Yeah, Panos, thank you. These are important and, if you allow me to say, quite difficult questions. Let me, and they're difficult because they go really right to the heart of the problem with prioritization. You know, if humanitarians knew that there was guaranteed funding through some kind of a tax that was applied on member states, then we wouldn't be in the situation where we are now. I mean, I find it astonishing that given the nature of how humanitarian action is going globally, we're still in situations where frontline partners are desperately trying to get funding in order to keep people alive, while other parts of the UN system and the international system are sitting on tons of money because there are assessed contributions, essentially taxes, that are applied to member states. That clearly should be the case for us, and I think it is wholly unacceptable that at this point in history that hasn't yet happened. Having said all of that, let me take a stab at this issue of how you incentivize solidarity. I mean, one of the things that we were very keen to avoid in the case of Iraq is a situation that unfortunately we've seen in other places. This is where clusters and partners and humanitarian actors are involved in a kind of a gaming with the government, a gaming with partners, a gaming with donors, a gaming with each other, all trying to get one hand up, compete more effectively for a limited set of funds. Right? We've seen this before. And this is not what we wanted to have in the case of Iraq. We wanted to have a solidarity-based operation where, number one, we had gone through a process. We may not have agreed with the process, but we had gone through a process that gave us all confidence in the outcome. Again, it may not be an outcome that we were particularly happy with, but one that we understood the logic of and one that we felt was credible. In incentivizing solidarity-based behavior on the part of all of the actors, there were a couple of key decisions that we made. First of all, we did not pretend that there was entitlement funding. In other words, when we had roughly identified the scope of what the appeal would be, what we didn't do is then say, okay, you are entitled to X amount of that because you represent a certain constituency. We didn't do that. And that was quite a difficult process for us. In fact, politically, that was probably the most sensitive because we had an entitlement approach in the former SRP, and we were trying to overcome that with the approach we were taking. So we didn't set any ceilings. We didn't allow for there to be anything that looked like an entitlement to a certain piece of the pie. The next thing that was very important for us, and this I think for many of us we would recognize as one of the failures of our process, is that we didn't do intercluster prioritization. And I hope that colleagues will allow us to be very upfront about why we didn't do it. When we started this process, a very prominent donor said to us, it is your job to tell the donors whether water is more important or food is more important, whether protection is more important or education is more important. And, you know, to be frank, we just wouldn't do that. We were not prepared to say that it is more important to a family which has fled for their lives and doesn't have any assets. It just wasn't acceptable for us to say, okay, donor, we're going to do that for you and say you should put the money into the food cluster but not put it into the health cluster. Yeah, we didn't do it. And having once decided that we were going to resist what we saw as a completely unacceptable form of prioritization, and again, I hope you will allow us to be honest, it was pretty hard for us to agree to do prioritization that represented a step back from the minimum international package, the standard. You know, if you're a humanitarian, you don't divide a standard, you uphold the standard. And it was gut-wrenching for us to one, affirm the standard and then say, oh, but because of the context we're in, we're only going to do a minimum package. All right, we did do that step. But we did not do what we were being pushed to do, which was to further prioritize within clusters. And again, I'm just trying to be really frank here with people about how politically and morally difficult this stuff is. I also have to be frank in saying that when we launched the appeal, we were also very upfront. with particularly donors in saying that, you know, this could be a slippery slope that we're on. You know, once you back off of the international standards, when do you stop doing that? And that's why I'm being honest in using words like, we did this with trepidation. We insisted on identifying the ethical gap and so forth, because we are very nervous about the precedent that's being set, and I'm not sure that we are entirely convinced it is the right thing to do. There was a collective recognition that it was one of the only options that we were allowed because of the shocking failure of donors to step forward and keep this L3 emergency going. In terms of the issue of how do you get partners that you know, are struggling to work together to in fact collaborate. And you know, here really the key to our approach is to empower those cluster leaders and coordinators. We have co-coordinators, so each cluster is led by a representative from the lead agency and also from the NGO community. And all the way through this, we said to the cluster coordinators, you manage this process. You are empowered to lead your teams. And another point that we all insisted on, and again, I hope this comment isn't misunderstood, but we assumed that actors were going to behave in good faith. This is this point that we were making about stopping the gaming, stopping the competition, promoting solidarity-based responsiveness, making sure that people understood that there was a collective and shared commitment to what we were trying to do, and holding that banner high and behaving as a country team on the basis of those principles. If you allow me one small and final anecdote, when we started the process, you had a number of UN agencies that felt entitled to a certain amount of funding. As we went through this process, you could see a dramatic change and transformation in the way that they were approaching the exercise, to the point where one of the agencies, I'm not going to name it if you allow me not to, who had started off saying, we must receive this. At the end of the process, that very same agency said, you know, I can see that we have more money than many other agencies and many other NGOs, so we're going to forego our ask because we know that another part of the operation needs it more. And that's the kind of incentivizing of solidarity-based commitment and behavior that was one of the positive outcomes of this very difficult, ethical, and politically fraught process that we went through, which I would really like to be clear is not a process of our choosing. We didn't want to do it. And I would hope that we don't have to again, that we can insist on that minimum standard and know that the international community will step up. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz, and really thanks for your blunt and very open feedback on what sounds like a heart-wrenching, challenging, impossible task. And of course, at the end of the path of it, still looking at being able to address the minimum of the minimum standards that you have there with the resources that are desperately needed for the Iraq operation. I'm actually going to take another question that came from two different colleagues and go first to Emily, but I'm also going to ask Dylan to reply to the same question, which is related to accountability of affected people. Emily, one of the listeners is saying, but we're hearing that it's the HCT that has to have a transparent discussion. Does this mean really that the affected people populations are not consulted and their voice is not taken into consideration in the prioritise process? It sounds like prioritization is really done at the country team members only. Can you give us your views on that, Emily?
Yes, Panos. But in fact, I've seen that in DRC, we have activity-based HRP costing, so it's a little bit different maybe from other contexts. Because here in DRC, the Humanitarian Action Plan, so the HRP, HNO, it's just a plan where we did some prioritization in terms of crisis and in terms of geographical areas and the number of estimated people to reach with minimum package of activities and for each cluster a threshold trigger to know when we are going to intervene or not. But we don't. So that's why it's at the HCT. It's just like a plan, but it is put in practice through projects when we launch the appeal and we have, for example, through the pool fund, it's in projects where we can do the individual prioritization, and there it's really important in needs assessment to do it with affected people, and it's really important for every actor and especially NGOs to define with affected people on their priorities in terms of needs, which sector, what kind of, what are their priorities, what if they have some specific needs, and how we can target beneficiaries. And it's really important to have communication and implication of beneficiaries for the success of the action, and it is part of the protection mainstreaming, the accountability to affected people. And in DRC, in every cluster, we include some activities of protection mainstreaming to advise partners how they can, for example, in food security, how can they do protection mainstreaming, how can they involve beneficiaries, and how they can do some mechanism of feedbacks and complaints. We have agreed for protection mainstreaming, and one is about accountability to affected people, and we try through project to have a more open way of giving giving help and activities of life saving is through cash and voucher. And here too in DRC we focus lots in cash and voucher to give the opportunity for affected people to choose what is the most important for them. And just to give an example of mechanism of feedbacks, in some projects we try to have free numbers where beneficiaries can complain if they have if we didn't take into account their needs, they can complain with free numbers or focal points in communities, and it is to the partner to change their way of doing. So we try to do something about accountability to affected people. Back to you.
Thanks, Emily. I'd like actually to go now to London and ask Dylan. Dylan, you receive obviously many proposals, and I'm sure the prioritization question is the one you always or often ask. Do you always ask the operations, or do you see to what extent the affected people have given their view? What difference does it make from a donor perspective, and how important is it when you look at projects to ensure that the voice and this relation of respect with the affected people is applied when forming a priority proposal that comes to you? Dylan, over to you.
Thanks, Panos. And I'm first of all really pleased that Emily mentioned cash, because I think that's a really important area for us to look at for the future, and I think that does offer a great deal of more accountability to people, to give them the choice to basically have what they need. Yes, of course it makes a difference to us. We're very keen on accountability to affected populations, but I think the real challenge is we're not very good at doing it. both within DFID but also more broadly. So, we want to see this in assessment, in planning, in monitoring and evaluation. It's really important, and it's a really important agenda as part of the World Humanitarian Summit. We need to get much better at doing it. And we are looking at ourselves at how can we use new technology, how can we use social media. There are some good examples of use of Facebook and other kinds of media in various crises. We've got, at the moment, I think there's a system-wide approach to AAP in Nepal as part of a Nepal platform, which I think offers some real sort of exciting ways forward for the future. But I do think the challenge here is really to take it to scale, but not only to look at new technologies, also to look at old technologies. So, for example, last week I sat on a panel at the CDAC meeting on communicating with disaster-affected communities, and I think there's a lot more we can do to prioritise this issue within appeals themselves. How can we use traditional media? How can we use radio? How are we better able to engage communities, particularly on issues like protection? And again, there's an entry point there through the whole of system approach on protection. So yes, it's absolutely fundamentally important to donors as we look at and monitor how we respond to crises. But I think there's a way to go yet in terms of mainstreaming this, making sure that we are able to provide the resources, particularly to pick this up. I just also, panel, so I've got the mic, wanted to respond to Lisa's impassioned sort of comments around donors and financing. I think we also really struggle with this issue, and I think that there is a need to get new donors on board. There's a need to get new mechanisms, insurance, for example, from the private sector. There's a need to take money out of the humanitarian system and put it on the development budget. And again, this is one of our big approaches, I think, to the Humanitarian Summit. How can we get much better, more resources into the kind of things that we all care about? And I think that we're really keen to hear what the high-level panel on financing will also say. So sorry to drop that in there, but I thought, this is a really, really critical issue, and I think will hopefully complement some of the sort of discussion we've been having on prioritisation. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Thanks for highlighting the importance of AAP also from a donor perspective. And I'm also glad you picked up to respond to Liz's passionate question. I'm sure she will want to tell you a lot more on a one-to-one basis on her challenges and frustrations on the ground. Actually, Liz, there is another question that just came for you, which I'd like to take forward before I move to the next one, which is really a listener in Nigeria is actually sending us a question to say that you've talked about prioritization, you've talked about how you basically have the data and move on to establish the boundaries, but really this requires that you have enough data, enough knowledge, enough of the information on the situation. So from a practical point of view, how do you do prioritization in a context where you have very limited data, very little up-to-date knowledge, and the situation is changing quite fast? How do you do a prioritization within such an impossible context? Liz, over to you.
This is a really important point, and it's something which the humanitarian operation in Iraq has struggled with and is struggling with. As an L3 emergency, we recently had the operational peer review team come out, Panos, of course, led by yourself, that looked at what parts of the operation continued to need surge capacity and support. And one of the areas that we all acknowledge we're doing the worst at is coming up with the kind of solid numbers that our colleague is talking about. Making sure that our needs assessment meet the standards that are expected by the beneficiaries, by our host governments, and by donors. And in the case of Iraq, that just isn't the case. As I mentioned when I was describing the prioritization process, we started off with the hope that we would be able to have a standardized methodology that would be used across all geographic areas and clusters, and we failed to do that. And that has meant that the information base, the data database, the evidence base for the decisions that we were taking was not as strong as we wanted. We've been upfront about that. You know, we're not trying to hide that fact, and we are committed as a country team based on the recommendations that the operational peer review has given us to get that better. You know, the answer to the question of what do you do when you don't have enough evidence, you use the evidence you do have, I think, is the first step. And the second step is to do your very best to try and identify where there could be flaws or inaccuracies in the evidence you have, triangulate it. In other words, many of us have worked with insufficient or incomplete data sets before, and there are ways that you can try and mitigate what some of the failings of those data sets are. But it is something which, if you get your data wrong, it raises important questions about everything else that you're trying to do, particularly if you are involved in targeting. And that's why as much attention as possible needs to be paid to that issue, and that's why here in Iraq we are taking quite decisive steps now to get that part of our operation. There are many parts that are not on rails, and of all of those, we want to make sure that this one gets on rails first.
Thanks, Liz, for your pragmatic and realistic and doing with whatever you have to be able to take it forward. I'm actually going to go to Andy. And Andy, there is actually, again, a number of actors, scholars, who are saying, who have brought to the table the role of the government, the host government, who are, of course, often have their own response, or they're really a key actor. And the question is, how really can we convince the governments to follow the humanitarian needs overview or the strategic response plan, where some governments actually see these tools as kind of almost the foreigners or the international actors process, and they see their own, or they don't see themselves as being part of it. So if you can tell us about how the role of the host governments and their engagement could be on the process, and including the prioritization. Over to you, Andy.
Thanks, Panos. I mean, I think we have to restate that the needs that we are identifying in these crises, it's the primary responsibility of the governments of these countries affected by the crises. It's their primary responsibility to meet those needs, and as we know, we're there in support, often making up for a large lack of capacity. And our ability to work with the governments in some of those cases is quite limited, especially when they're involved or in the situation that's creating the crisis. However, it is important during all phases of assessing needs, planning, prioritizing, monitoring, that we involve them to the extent possible. One, because we need their support for what we're trying to do, and we need them to understand clearly what we are setting out to achieve. But two, because as one of the questions has stated, you may have a number of local actors that are participating, whether in the coordination mechanisms or actually implementing some of the activities in the plan. So that local involvement in buy-in is critical, and governments will want to see how that was done. I mean, the challenges are going to come when potentially the activities or the levels of vulnerability that we've identified in a given crisis don't quite coincide with what the government believes are the most severely hit areas, and that's where we need to remain true to our principles and base our planning and interventions on what we believe to be the areas in which we need to focus our response. So it can get complicated in some situations, but particularly in some of the protracted crises where we are trying to work ourselves out of a job there. We do want to see the eventual drawdown of humanitarian assistance. That depends very much on the ability of governments to take on responding to new crises, helping those people that still require some kind of social safety net. So unless we involve those governments from the beginning, the chances that we're actually going to be able to withdraw at one point become pretty slim. Back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Andy. So a very loud and clear message. Do involve the host government at every step early enough. Their engagement and involvement is really crucial. We have about 10 minutes or so left. I still have in front of me several questions that you have sent. I want to point out to the fact that you can see in front of you on the right bottom hand side of the screen a polling that we have put up. As you're listening, please, we want to encourage you to give us your feedback on how you found this webinar and suggestions for future webinars as we are really preparing. We appreciate your honest, your blunt feedback on how this webinar has gone. I'm actually going to move now to Kinshasa. Emily, back to you. And a listener actually has sent a question saying, in a situation, in a crisis like in Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been protracted, going on for a number of years, how do you do this prioritization? Are you just looking at life-saving criteria? And how does this match with longer-term criteria that the people may have? Emily, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Panos. Of course, DRC has huge needs for life-saving activities in terms of protection, malnutrition, health for the most vulnerable. But because we are a protracted crisis, many NGOs and donors push to add some resilience activities in our HRP. It is one of our transversal themes in the HRP. And for example, as I said before, for the standard allocation of the pool fund, we have a resilience approach too. It's because we have to fight the roots to help people to absorb shocks, to avoid the repetition of the crisis and the chronicity of the assistance. Of course, it should not hamper the answer based on needs. But for example, in malnutrition, we have one crisis focused on malnutrition, and it's really important to have some activities of prevention and a more resilient approach to strengthen the capacity of families, of vulnerable families to for healthy food, to have some activities of food security, for having crops and how to, which kind of crops they could grow, and for example, wash actions, to every other activities to avoid the repetition of malnutrition. And it's very important for us, for NGOs, and to have this kind of life-saving and resilience approach. So even in the HRP, we have, in every cluster, we have some actions to answer the need, the emergency, some actions of some activities for prevention and preparedness, and also in terms of exit strategy to promote autonomy, sustainable solutions, etc. And it is really important to have cross-clusters approach in these kind of resilience activities. As I said before, from malnutrition, you said it is we have a holistic approach of how to help the affected family in terms of malnutrition. It's more important than only separate separate approach by cluster. So we try to push to a cross-cluster approach and resilience activities without hampering their answer based on needs. Okay, back to you, Panos.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going now to go to Dylan, and then I'm going to go to Liz after that. Dylan, it's a two-part question that comes prompted by what you've said a minute ago. The first question is related to are there any trends, are there any particular type of activities that you as donors, can I ask somebody who doesn't have unmuted microphone? Dylan, if you could, yeah. So back to the question, are there any trends or type of activities that as donors you tend to prioritize? You spoke about cash, maybe self-reliance, or are there any particular activities that are kind of more fashionable or more interest in terms of when you look at the prioritization that you take on the ground? If you could really share your views.
Okay, thanks, Panos. I mean, it's a good question. I think I'll stick by my line from before that actually this is about need, and that we aren't best placed to judge that. We need to work with those on the ground, but of course where we have country offices, our advisors will have a view on that. If you look at this at a global level, though, we do see DFID as having, and our Secretary of State has set this out, a special interest in some areas. So, for example, violence against women and girls and protection, particularly gender issues, is something that DFID sees as a really important issue globally. We don't see enough attention on it. We want to do more. But of course, this isn't despite other groups. This is part of our overall approach to reaching the most vulnerable. I think we do prioritise ourselves, wanting to see how we offer better value for money in the system. So looking at efficiency, how can we resolve some of the sort of gaps in financing through more efficiency? And I think cash, plays a role in that as well as reaching others. We, of course, will prioritise our funding by low-income countries. So there's a kind of geographical footprint that DFID has, but we will always respond to major emergencies. So I think it's difficult for me to sort of pinpoint a specific priority that we have, but certainly for DFID, and I suppose I should also say, we don't have any divide between our humanitarian and development budgets. So we will plan our programming purely related to the context and not try to divide up the humanitarian only or the development. So, for example, in long-term protective prices, we will be looking at long-term delivery of basic services, etc. We are, at the moment, though, also looking at prioritising risk management and resilience and preparedness. So I'm really pleased that that's come up as a bit of a theme. We see this as a way of reducing the impact of prices on people, be a way of getting much better value for money. I think we see, I think it's $4 in response to $1 in preparedness in terms of costs of the emergency. So that's a bit of how we make things go further. And I also believe that, particularly in natural disasters, we should be working much more with governments, through governments, and looking at how governments themselves can be supporting some of these things. So I guess that's a sort of not quite a straightforward answer to your question. Donors are always going to have priorities because ministers and governments always do. Ours specifically, as I said, are around the violence against women and girls, but actually, if you look at DFID's overall priorities, our Secretary of State has sort of at least 3, of which one is humanitarian, one is women and girls, and one is economic opportunity. So all quite relevant to these issues. Thank you.
Thanks, Dylan. Actually, what you said prompted a provocative question from another of the listeners, who is basically saying, Dylan, it's again back to you, and if you could be very brief, because we're really running out of time and I still want to go to Iraq for one more question. So the question is, the transformative agenda called for evidence-based, needs-based and results-based planning. Yet we've been talking here on the webinar about prioritization, and it looks like we're going back to a resource-based planning. instead of a needs or an evidence-based planning? How do you square the circle? Dylan, if you can give us very briefly your thoughts.
So I think my basic answer is no. We're about needs-based planning, and actually we need to see results within that, and we need to look at some of the issues around values providing. But absolutely, we have an approach which is based on need and need alone, and I think that's really important to reconfirm.
Thank you. I'm going to move. There is a caller actually from Yemen, and Liz, this is for you, who has sent a question basically asking about prioritization and on two fronts. One is with regards to the women and girls' needs, saying that, we're looking at a prioritization, we're trying to look at it from a different points of view. Andy talked about the boundaries and the steps we go about it. How do we ensure that the particular needs of women and girls are included? And how do we manage, while sometimes there is certain perceptions within governments, within culture, really saying that that may not be appropriate. And linked to that, there is also another caller who has said, how do you prioritize within HCT the protection strategy, and particularly the centrality of protection? How do you put it in between so many priorities, including life-saving needs on the ground that take place? Liz, over to you.
Panos, on the first question about how, at least in the case of Iraq, we tried to make sure that women and girls issues were part of the process in the most prominent way. What we did was to very aggressively and proactively use the gender marker, not just to evaluate individual projects, but at all steps of the prioritization exercise. So when we were, as a country team, identifying our 5 big strategic priorities, we used the gender marker. When each cluster was identifying or confirming its minimum package, the gender marker was used. When the clusters were sequencing those packages across the first, second, and third line response, the gender marker was used. And we found that by insisting on the importance of the gender marker as a way at all stages of the process in putting the issue of women and girls front and center, it forced us to do the same. So that was the way that we tried to handle that issue. On the question about how governments and our counterparts react to our strategic priorities, of course, this is a point that's been raised earlier by a number of panelists. The more that the government is involved with you at the very beginning of the prioritization exercise, from the definition of humanitarian needs, through the confirmation of the international standards, through the identification of minimum packages and their sequencing, the more that the government, of course, understands the way in which we are approaching these questions, and as the party primarily responsible for humanitarian assistance, can also guide us. And that has been our experience here, where gender issues continue to be a sensitive question. On the important point about the prima paris role of protection, one of the things that our protection cluster did when they were defining their first line response was to say that as a first line response for the cluster, one of the most important things that they did was to identify critical protection needs that additional other clusters needed to address. Okay, so they, as a cluster, would identify protection concerns that had to be addressed by, for example, the WASH cluster or the shelter cluster. And that is actually one of their first line response activities. By doing that, the cluster was in a sense positioning itself not only as a key part of the advocacy engine for the operation, but they were part of the enabling response part of our operation. So their self-identification as a cluster took on that function on behalf of other clusters. And that's been one of the ways that we've tried to ensure that protection remains central to everything we do. We also made sure that in our 5 strategic overarching priorities, that special protection programs for special protection needs was literally our very first objective. And of course, all clusters in defining their minimum package were expected to meet those objectives. And by making protection the #1 objective, it of course was a very clear steer to the clusters, every single one of them, that they had to do the same. Over to you, Panos.
Thanks, Liz. We've really run out of time, but again, there is more than one question that has come, and this is really the last question to you, Andy. And again, it's a twofold question that we have received from two different people. If you can again walk us through how to involve the affected people in the prioritization within the program cycle in 2 words, very briefly, and the caller is asking on that. But also there's another caller who is saying about the HIV needs, that basically how we often notice that HIV has been left outside the prioritization. How do we ensure that HIV is mainstream in the Humanitarian Response Plan? And before you answer, I want also to point out that you see in front of you on the screen the website, the email, the name of where you can get help. If you would really like to engage with the experts, Ignacio Leon at OCHA Geneva, to further tailor-make your prioritization, you can see his email, telephone, and how to contact him. So, Andrew, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Panos. Yeah, on accountability to affected people, I know this is a difficult one because we still struggle, I think, as a collective with identifying or determining what it means to be collectively accountable to affected people. But the reality is, I think we are beginning to improve that accountability in a number of areas through the collective work we're doing to implement the program cycle. And this begins with the needs assessment and analysis. In most cases today, I think we are actually, or needs assessments are being conducted in a participatory fashion, involving communities, not just in identifying what the needs are, but in identifying what's the most appropriate way to meet those needs. So that information is already a part of the needs analysis that is then used to inform the planning. Less so, I think, does that feedback or that communication with the affected communities happen during the planning phase, but ideally we should go back to them after we've done our needs analysis and determine what we're going to do to meet their needs, just to have a double check. It's complicated in some situations, but it is advisable to try to do it. Now, when it comes to prioritization, that is a bit more of an exercise that's internal to the collective. That's us, based on our expertise, determining what actually needs to happen first. It's that sequencing that we've talked about at a number of different points during the webinar. It's not saying whose needs are a higher priority than somebody else's needs, but if we are going to achieve our objectives, what exactly do we need to do first as we're beginning to implement the plan? Now, the next point at which that AAP comes in is when we start doing monitoring and we see what we've done, what we've achieved, have we provided the right assistance, have we actually met the needs, and it's during that monitoring that I think we'll also see, was our prioritization right? Did we get the timing of the different activities right, or are we failing in that regard? And I think that, again, the feedback we're getting from communities on that front will be helpful. So it has to be, again, a part of the approach throughout. It's not just a matter of ticking boxes, but really putting the affected people at the center of the response and all of the different phases of the program cycle. We did have a question from one participant on HIV who made an observation that HIV activities seem to be dropping out of the operations in a number of cases. I can't talk specifically about why that's happening, but it would be interesting to look a bit closer. Is it, for example, that certain HIV activities are not necessarily falling within the boundaries of a given humanitarian response plan, and therefore are being, as the participant suggested, left behind? Or is it a matter of those HIV activities not necessarily being in the most urgent, high priority needs that need to be put in place at a given moment in time? And in that case, they shouldn't be getting left behind because they remain a part of the plan. The point is they may just be resourced a bit later on in the operation. So I don't think there's any, obviously there's no consistent approach that's resulting in HIV being left behind, but I think we need to take a little bit closer look at exactly why, where are the cases where that's been observed, and why it has happened. And then just to wrap up, thanks to Panos for providing the contact information of Ignacio, who's chief of the Planning and Monitoring section in the Program Support Branch. It's Ignacio and his team that are providing technical support to humanitarian country teams on how to actually do that prioritization within the program cycle. So he's an excellent resource to turn to because, of course, we know you'll need more practical information than we've been able to provide in this short hour and a half. Back to you, Panos.
Thank you, Andy. This really brings an end to this webinar. We have run way over time. I appreciate, first of all, the speakers, Liz Grande, Emily Fernandez, Dylan Winder, Andrew Wiley. Really appreciate your sharing your reflections and best practices from operations. I want to say a big thank you to all over 100 participants who attended this briefing. I want to highlight that the webinar background documents are on the link that you see in front of you. Thank you very much for being with us and looking forward to having you in future webinars. Thank you and goodbye.